At 2 a.m., a 45-car freight train departs Volgograd, bound for Port of Olya on the Caspian Sea. Hidden inside its reinforced central cars is nearly $1 billion in advanced missile systems and long-range strike drones, a shipment capable of shifting the balance of firepower in Iran within days. Moscow believes the southern rail corridor is secure, protected by distance and a direct rail-to-sea transfer entirely inside Russian territory. But with just 300 kilometers left before reaching Olya, an explosion tears through the center of the train. A wall of fire races down the track, and a column of flame rises into the night sky. What was meant to cross the Caspian never reaches the sea. So, who tracked the shipment? Who struck it? And how did Russia's safest southern route turn into its most expensive rail loss of the war? Stay with us as we break down how this operation unfolded, step by step, and why the Caspian corridor will never move unseen again. At 2 a.m., a heavily loaded freight train departed from a rail junction outside Volgograd in southern Russia. Ukrainian intelligence was already monitoring the southern rail corridor when the train began moving. Its destination was the Port of Olya, located in Astrakhan Oblast on the northern shoreline of the Caspian Sea. The route covered approximately 1,600 kilometers. Estimated travel time, 30 to 36 hours. The train consisted of 45 rail cars, 42 freight units and 3 technical escort cars positioned at the front and rear. On official shipping manifests, the cargo was described as industrial components and mechanical assemblies. But Ukrainian surveillance analysts had assessed the shipment differently. 8 central cars were reinforced with additional steel plating. 26 sealed container units were grouped tightly in the middle of the formation. 4 flatbed cars carried covered launch frames secured beneath heavy tarpaulins. The total cargo weight was assessed between 1,300 and 1,600 metric tons. Ukrainian intelligence estimates indicated the train was transporting approximately 52 short-range ballistic missile bodies and 30 solid-fuel rocket motors. Additional containers were believed to hold around 140 reconnaissance and strike unmanned aerial systems packed in modular crates. Nearly 95 inertial navigation and satellite guidance units were stored in reinforced cases, along with 44 detachable warhead assemblies. The combined military value of the shipment was estimated between $900 million and $1.1 billion US. For Ukraine, the implications were immediate. If the train reached Port of Olya, the transfer process would be rapid. Rail cargo could be offloaded directly onto Caspian cargo vessels within hours. From Olya, maritime transit to Iranian ports across the Caspian Sea would take less than 24 hours. Port of Olya functions as one of Russia's primary rail-to-sea gateways on the Caspian, handling hundreds of thousands of tons of freight each month and connecting directly to the southern railway grid. For Moscow, the corridor offered strategic advantages. It avoided monitored Black Sea routes. It remained entirely within Russian-controlled territory, and it provided a discrete inland-to-maritime transfer point. But rail transport carries one unavoidable weakness. It follows fixed tracks, and fixed tracks can be mapped. By the time the train passed the halfway point of its journey, Ukrainian surveillance platforms were tracking its movement continuously. The shipment was no longer just cargo. It was a Ukrainian identified target moving south toward Port of Olya. The train was not identified by accident. It was identified through layered surveillance. The first anomaly appeared before departure. Satellite imagery showed 8 reinforced rail cars positioned at the center of the 45-car formation. The steel plating thickness was assessed at approximately 20 to 30 millimeters, unusual for civilian freight. Thermal imaging detected sustained internal heat signatures inside multiple central containers. Solid fuel rocket motors retain heat differently than industrial equipment. That observation triggered deeper monitoring. Signals intelligence then intercepted encrypted coordination traffic between a southern logistics command node and railway control authorities. The communication referenced priority routing and restricted handling. Civilian cargo does not move under military priority. As the train moved south, aerial confirmation followed. A long-range reconnaissance platform captured high-resolution imagery of the formation during a scheduled slowdown. The count matched earlier assessment: 45 rail cars, 8 reinforced units in the center, 4 flatbeds carrying covered launch structures. Security detachments were visible near selected junctions along the route. radio emissions analysis detected short encrypted bursts originating from within the central freight cluster. By the time the train crossed the 800-kilometer mark of its 1,600-kilometer journey, the picture was complete. More than 50 ballistic missile bodies, approximately 30 solid-fuel rocket motors, over 140 unmanned aerial systems packed in modular crates, 95 navigation and guidance modules, 44 detachable warhead assemblies. The shipment was no longer assessed as suspicious. It was confirmed as a large-scale military transfer heading toward the Port of Olya. At its current speed, the train would arrive within 18 to 20 hours. Once unloaded and transferred to Caspian cargo vessels, interception would become significantly more difficult. Tracking had established scale, imagery had confirmed configuration, signals had validated military coordination. The decision phase was approaching, and the window was narrowing. By late afternoon, the train had covered more than half of its 1,600-kilometer route. Ukrainian intelligence continued tracking the formation as it moved steadily south at an average speed of 60 kilometers per hour. At that pace, it would reach the Port of Olya within 18 hours. For Ukrainian planners, the window was narrowing. 3 operational options were evaluated. The first was immediate action along the northern segment of the route. That option carried higher escalation risk and increased visibility near major rail infrastructure. The second was to wait until the train approached Astrakhan Oblast, closer to Olya. But Russian security presence near the port region was stronger, and response forces could mobilize rapidly. The third option focused on a remote stretch of rail approximately 300 kilometers north of Olya. The terrain there was open and sparsely populated. Civilian traffic was limited. Military patrol density along that segment was comparatively low. For Ukraine, that corridor offered the highest probability of isolating the target before maritime transfer. Timing became decisive. If the train continued uninterrupted, offloading at Port of Olya could begin within hours of arrival. Rail-to-sea transfer operations typically required less than 3 hours under controlled conditions. Once cargo vessels departed across the Caspian Sea, interception opportunities would drop sharply. Ukrainian operational models indicated that within 24 hours of docking, the shipment could already be moving toward Iranian ports. That compressed the strike window. Weather conditions were assessed. Wind speeds along the selected rail segment were within operational limits for long-range Ukrainian unmanned strike systems. Visibility conditions favored low-altitude approach. A strike against a moving train risked partial destruction. A strike against a fixed train would maximize loss. Ukrainian planners defined the objective clearly: not symbolic damage, total interdiction. 45 cars, up to $1 billion in military hardware, more than 50 missile bodies and over 100 drone systems. If Ukraine acted, it had to eliminate the shipment before it reached Olya. The decision moved from monitoring to execution planning. The next phase would shift from surveillance to direct action. And once initiated, it would unfold in minutes, not hours. Once the remote rail segment was selected, planning accelerated. The chosen strike zone lay roughly 300 kilometers north of the Port of Olya, along a sparsely populated corridor with limited civilian infrastructure. Rail traffic in that area averaged fewer than 6 freight movements per day. The terrain was flat and exposed. There were no major urban centers within a 20-kilometer radius. The objective was precise. The train had to be slowed, isolated, and fixed in position before any strike assets were committed. Rail transport offers efficiency, but it also follows a rigid signaling system. Control that system, and the train becomes predictable. Cyber units began targeting the automated rail control network responsible for managing a 15-kilometer stretch of track inside the designated zone. The system relied on synchronized signal relays spaced at regular intervals. If multiple relays failed simultaneously, standard safety protocol would force the train to reduce speed. Electronic warfare support was prepared to disrupt onboard and ground-based communications. The goal was not to blind an entire region. It was to create a temporary pocket of disruption around a single moving target. Strike assets were positioned in advance. 6 long-range unmanned strike platforms were assigned to the operation. Each carried a payload sufficient to penetrate reinforced rail cars and ignite volatile material stored within. Target priorities were established. Primary aim points included the central reinforced cars believed to contain solid-fuel rocket motors. Secondary targets included flatbeds carrying launch structures and containers assessed to hold warhead assemblies. Total engagement time, once initiated, was projected at under 6 minutes. The entire sequence depended on timing. If the train passed beyond the designated zone, the opportunity would close. If it reached Astrakhan air defense coverage closer to Olya, interception risk would increase. By early evening, the train was less than 2 hours from the selected segment, tracking confirmed speed at 58 kilometers per hour. All strike platforms were on standby. The plan was no longer theoretical. It was synchronized. Observation had defined the target. Now the operation moved toward execution. Within hours, the Caspian rail corridor would either remain intact or be permanently exposed. The train entered the designated rail segment shortly after nightfall. Speed held steady at just under 60 kilometers per hour. The strike window had opened. The first action was not explosive. It was digital. Simultaneously, multiple rail signal relays across a 15-kilometer stretch began transmitting conflicting status data. Within seconds, the automated control network detected irregularities. Standard safety protocol activated. Signal indicators along the line shifted to caution. Inside the locomotive cabin, warning alerts triggered. The engineer reduced throttle. Speed dropped from 58 to 35 kilometers per hour, then to 20. Electronic interference followed. Short-range communications between escort units and regional control nodes began to degrade. Encrypted bursts failed to transmit fully. Radio channels filled with static. The disruption was contained within the strike corridor. Outside that pocket, the rail network functioned normally. Inside it, the train was increasingly isolated. At reduced speed, the formation entered the center of the selected zone. A second wave of signal failure forced a full stop. Braking pressure increased gradually to prevent derailment. 45 rail cars settled motionless on open track. From deceleration to complete stop, the sequence lasted less than 2 minutes. Security units near the forward cars attempted to re-establish contact with railway control. They received no clear response. Thermal surveillance confirmed the train's stationary status. 45 cars, 8 reinforced central units, all aligned within the predefined engagement grid. This was the moment planners had anticipated. A moving target is difficult to neutralize completely. A stationary train loaded with solid-fuel rocket motors and warhead assemblies presents a different equation. Within the disruption corridor, there were no active rail crossings, no adjacent civilian traffic, and no urban infrastructure within immediate blast radius. The objective had been achieved. The train was fixed in place. All that remained was the strike. Overhead, unmanned platforms adjusted final approach vectors. Target coordinates were already locked. The next phase would not unfold over hours. It would unfold in seconds. And once initiated, there would be no recovery window for the Caspian shipment heading toward Olya. The first impact struck the center of the formation. One of the reinforced rail cars erupted in a flash of light and pressure. For a brief moment, the damage appeared contained. A localized detonation inside a single armored unit. Then the temperature spike surged. Inside that car were solid fuel rocket motors. Heat builds rapidly in sealed compartments. 30 seconds later, the first secondary explosion tore through the side plating. Flame and debris burst outward across the adjacent trackbed. A second strike hit a flatbed unit carrying covered launch structures. The tarp ignited instantly. Fragments of composite material scattered across the rail line. 2 additional munitions impacted the central container cluster within seconds of each other. One penetrated a unit assessed to contain detachable warhead assemblies. The resulting blast wave was significantly stronger than the initial detonation. Shock pressure rolled down the length of the train. Cars 3 through 7 from the center were lifted partially off alignment. Thermal sensors recorded peak temperatures exceeding 1800 degrees Celsius within the core section. The chain reaction had begun. One burning container ignited the next. Rocket propellant fed the fire. Metal seams ruptured under internal pressure. Within 4 minutes, more than a dozen secondary explosions were detected along the formation. Flatbed-mounted drone systems detonated in sequence, their fuel cells contributing to the expanding fire zone. Security personnel moved away from the central blast area as additional explosions triggered unpredictably. From above, Infrared imagery showed a continuous line of fire stretching over 400 meters of track. 32 of the 45 railcars were either destroyed outright or consumed by fire. 9 more suffered catastrophic structural damage. Only 4 cars at the outer edges remained intact. Rail infrastructure beneath the central blast zone was severely compromised. Steel track segments warped. Wooden sleepers ignited. Sections of ballast were displaced by shock pressure. Total destructive phase time, under 6 minutes. The train that had departed at 2 a.m. with over $1 billion in military cargo was no longer a transport convoy. It was burning wreckage on an exposed stretch of rail 300 kilometers north of the Port of Olya. The Caspian shipment would go no further. By the time the fires began to subside, the scale of destruction was clear. Out of 45 rail cars, 32 were completely destroyed. 9 more were structurally compromised beyond recovery. Only 4 outer cars remained largely intact. The central section of the train, where the most sensitive cargo had been stored, was reduced to twisted metal and scorched debris. Post-strike analysis estimated that between 40 and 50 short-range ballistic missile bodies were lost in the explosion. At least 25 solid-fuel rocket motors were assessed as fully destroyed. More than 100 unmanned aerial systems were either burned or detonated during secondary blasts. 95 navigation and guidance modules, along with over 40 detachable warhead assemblies, were rendered unusable. The total material loss was estimated between $700 million and $1 billion US. But the physical damage was only part of the impact. The rail line itself suffered severe structural damage across a 400-meter segment. Steel rails warped under extreme heat. Track supports were shattered. Repair operations would require heavy engineering equipment and days of uninterrupted work. The Caspian Rail Corridor, intended to move high-value military cargo discreetly toward the Port of Olya, was no longer secure. Even if alternate routes were available, every future shipment would now move under the assumption of surveillance. Confidence in the corridor had been broken. Port of Olya never received the cargo scheduled for offload. No transfer to Caspian vessels occurred. No maritime transit toward Iranian ports began. The strategic effect extended beyond a single destroyed train. Rail transport had been chosen for efficiency and control. But fixed tracks create predictable pathways. And predictable pathways can be mapped, monitored, and interrupted. The shipment had traveled more than half its journey. It was within 300 kilometers of Olya, hours away from transfer. Yet it never reached the Caspian Sea. In modern warfare, destroying a launch site eliminates one weapon system. Disrupting a supply corridor delays dozens. This operation did not target a battlefield. It targeted the flow that feeds the battlefield. And once that flow is exposed, it rarely moves unseen again. This was not just a destroyed train. It was a Ukrainian deep interdiction operation inside Russian territory. For months, Moscow relied on the Caspian Rail Corridor to move high-value military cargo south without crossing contested waters. The assumption was simple. Inland rail movement would attract less scrutiny than air transport. Maritime transfer across the Caspian would remain outside direct confrontation. Volume would offset risk. Ukraine challenged all three. By tracking, fixing, and destroying the shipment before it reached Port of Olya, Ukrainian forces demonstrated an expanding capability to disrupt strategic logistics far from the front line. This was not a battlefield strike. It was logistics warfare. Rail infrastructure depends on predictability. Ports depend on timing. Once Ukraine proved the corridor could be mapped and intercepted, every future shipment along that route carries elevated risk. The material loss approached $1 billion, but the larger consequence is delay. Without those missile bodies and long-range strike drones, projected reinforcement timelines shift. Deployment cycles slow. Operational planning must adjust. For Ukraine, the message was clear. No transfer route is beyond reach. Not air, not sea, not rail. The train departed at 2 a.m. carrying hardware capable of altering the balance of firepower in Iran within days. It never reached the Caspian Sea. It never reached Olya. And it never completed the transfer that had been planned. In modern war, destroying equipment matters, but disrupting supply corridors matters more. This operation was not just an explosion on open track. It was Ukraine striking at the flow that feeds the battlefield. And once that flow is exposed, it rarely moves unseen again. If you found this breakdown useful, subscribe for more in-depth analysis of how modern supply lines shape the battlefield. And comment below with your view on whether targeting logistics changes the balance more than direct strikes.